So this will hopefully be a short video in which I explain often appearing concepts and terms when physicalists and idealists debate. Terms such as supervenience and mind-brain identity theory. Let's start off by defining physicalism. It is basically the idea that everything is physical. And that means different things depending on who you're asking. If you ask Descartes, for example, he would tell you that it has to do with spatial extension. But if you want a more like scientifically minded explanation or definition, it would be that it has to do with the elementary particles having properties like mass, charge, and spin. But what all definitions have in common is that they affirm that the physical is non-mental. So it has no mental properties, at least at the base level. Now that we kind of know what physicalism is, let's try to define supervenience. It is when a higher level phenomenon or property supervenes on a subvenient base. And it is usually described to be non-causal but dependent. And what I mean by that is that the supervenient property is dependent on the subvenient base. But it's not necessarily a causal relationship. To give some examples, or at least one example, look at the screen on which you're watching this video right now. You could say that the images or the text that you see on the screen supervenes on the pixels on the screen. So in this example, the images and the videos you see are dependent on the pixels on the screen. In order for you to change the higher level phenomena of whatever you see on your screen, you would have to change the pixels. But to give you one of my own examples that I think is better than what I found in the literature would be, for example, when music is said to supervene on a radio. The music that's being played is dependent on the radio, but it is not caused by the radio itself. It is caused by the radio station that sends out those radio signals. Now, what does this have to do with physicalism versus idealism types of debates? Well, usually when a physicalist would describe the relationship between the mind and the brain, they use the concept of supervenience, in which they would say that the mind supervenes on the brain, meaning that it is dependent on the brain. Like any change in the mind would necessitate a change in the brain activity. They wouldn't necessarily say that it's caused by the brain, but it is at least dependent on the brain. Any mental state have a corresponding physical state. Now I would like to cash out the supervenience relationship between the mind and the brain the way a physicalist may explain it. There are three main ideas here. The first one would be emergentism, that new properties can arise from an interaction of simpler components within a complex system. The second one would be functionalism, which states that mental states depend on its functional role. And the third one would be mind-brain identity theory, which is my favorite. And it is basically about the mind and the brain being numerically identical and thus sharing all the qualities and properties. So what it basically means is that all instances of experience or consciousness have an inside and an outside. So let's take pain as an example. So there would be an inside to the experience of pain, which would be the mental state. But then there would also be an outside appearance of pain, which would be the physical state, like, for example, C5 is fiery. And there are two main categories in mind-brain identity theory, one of type identity and token identity theory. In type identity theory, we would say in regards to the pain, for example, that it is identical to a specific type of brain event. Then we have the token-to-token version, which is more flexible because it has this concept of multiple realizability, in which the experience of pain can be realized in many different physical states. For example, different brain states, like in a human and in an octopus. Even though we have very different brains we share the experience of pain. Let's now get into some of the problems with mind-brain identity theory. Mind and brain are not truly identical because physicalism is smuggling in a dualistic assumption by defining and accounting for the physical in non-mental terms. Physical stuff, at least at the foundation, have no mental or experiential properties and can therefore not be identical to the mental. So physicalism creates two categories here: the mental or experiential, that we through direct acquaintance undeniably know is real, and a non-experiential category called physical, defined in non-mental terms. And if physicalists ascribe mental properties to matter, they would basically be affirming panpsychism if they broaden the definition of what it means to be physical. And they would no longer be physicalist. And now to the last part about how idealism solves the problem. A definition first. So analytic idealism holds to the position that everything is mental, including the brain. An idealist would say that what we colloquially call inanimate physical things are in fact the mental states of universal consciousness as viewed from a third-person perspective. And based on that, how would an idealist understand identity theory? Well, in the same way that pain from the inside is referring to an unpleasant phenomenal experience, from the outside or third-person perspective, it is brain activity. So my brain, or more broadly my body, is identical to my mental states, and they don't really interact because they are the same thing. They're identical. They're only viewed from different perspectives. So they are numerically identical and share all properties. Now a physicalist may object and probably say that I'm basically just mirroring the physicalist position. But the thing is that that a physicalist cannot say the same because they have already described and defined the physical as lacking mental properties. So they cannot be identical. Just like physicalism, under idealism, some things, like stones for example, don't have these two perspectives, an inside and an outside, because it is not disassociated from universal consciousness. A good analogy here would be dreams. So when you're dreaming at night, everything you experience in your dream are mental because they exist in your mind. So the street, the stones in your dream are mental. But even though they're mental, they don't have a point of view of their own. They don't have the stones in your dream don't have experiences of their own, but they do exist in experience, namely your experience in the dream state. And to add to that, we know empirically that minds can exist in other minds. So we have phenomena like DID, dissociative identity disorder, and split brain patients. Let's take DID. So it is when one person have several alters, and these alters, even though they exist in the same mind, they don't have access to each other's memories and experiences. So they feel themselves separate, even though they're all part of the same person, the same mind, the same subject. So disassociated minds can exist in a larger mind. And we know this again empirically. But in the case of physicalism, it has no account of why some arrangements of matter, like my brain, have a point of view, while others, like stones, do not.